And we are live with our 200th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everyone. Super excited to be back today for our 200th episode. It's quite a little accomplishment, I guess, for Ken and I, even though it's been super fun for 200 episodes. And to have back our first guest ever as well, Jerry. We're going to start trying some new stuff. For instance, this episode will be sponsored by Redpoint Security, right? Who is... That's basically my company, right? Like, let's be honest, right? But we've sponsored for a number of years, but we're going to start recognizing more of the people that are contributing to the podcast as well. So check out Redpoint Security if you have assessment needs, application security assessment needs. Otherwise, Ken and I will be at KernelCon. That's the big announcements that we've got today. I'm going to post the link. We're going to be training, doing practical secure code review there. The DEF CON trainings, for those of you that were going to attend the DEF CON training in Seattle or Bellevue, has been postponed. So that's going to happen later this year. It sounds like November, December timeframe. Instead, they had some logistical issues that popped up, so they've postponed. So instead, Ken and I are going to be back at KernelCon, back in Omaha. We're excited to be there. It was great last year. The team there is great. The conference is super fun. We'd encourage anyone to go. This is a great opportunity to get the course for a decent price as well, as well as support KernelCon at the same time. So it sounds like we'll all three of us be at KernelCon. So I'm looking forward to that. Outside of that, Ken, I don't think I have any other announcements at this point. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I don't think anybody watching this podcast will be there, but in the event that you happen to be at Frontrunner's JavaScript Node conference next Friday, I will actually be there. It's funny. I was looking at the schedule, and one of the awesome engineering leaders I worked with at GitHub pretty closely. I think we were working together on like the Code Spaces project. Anyway, she's going to be the keynote there, so I'm super stoked about that. So anyways, if you're going to be at Frontrunner's JS conference next Friday, hit me up either on Slack, DM, on Twitter, or whatever, and we'll catch up.
Sweet. Good. Well, yeah, let's dive into it. Jerry, what have you been up to lately, buddy?
Oh, a lot of work. We're still at Cisco, still doing the Cisco thing. So I'm really enjoying that and just kind of keeping up with the news and seeing where everybody's going and kind of watching some of the growth in the startup space. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people are launching. Saw a story that said that maybe this was because of all the layoffs, but I think most of these that I'm seeing come out of have been around for a while. So I don't think we're seeing that layoff bump yet, but maybe we'll see that layoff bump here, in the next 6 to 12 months. But a lot of people are starting a lot of cool things, and it's kind of interesting to see the wheels start to turn down there at the lower level and try to figure out what's going to be that next, unicorn, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to always happen when the layoffs hit, right? Because the engineers get together and decide, well, maybe we don't want to go look for a job, or while we're waiting and trying to interview, we're just going to start building something. I mean, I know Ken and I are very much on that, that same kind of path, right? Like the second that you have some extra time, you start to explore those other ideas. I mean, it's the same thing. Like I posted your site up there, like the CVE analysis that you've done is pretty awesome as well. But I don't know, right? Like, I haven't necessarily heard, but I'm not too tied into the developer side of things in the tech community. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah. I mean, and it's hard for people, especially people come from an open source background, right? Like I deal with that quite a bit. Like you have an idea and you're like, I could just do this and throw it on GitHub right now, or is this something that I should keep in my back pocket and maybe try to turn into some things? So I think there's a lot of thought around that, right? Like what's good for just giving back, and what should I try to turn into something that is profitable or might be a business for me? Because I think what we see is a lot of people kind of trip down that road into it's going to be open source, but I also want to try to run a business off of it. There haven't been that many successful of those kind of hybrid things. Docker is trying to be that, but we've seen the way that they've had to pivot hard to be kind of a pay for model, and people aren't too thrilled with that.
It's funny you say that, because I've had to, I've gone down the route. James and I talking to different people about the product space, and that's the same warning that everybody gives. Is like, don't like try to like start off with open source stuff and then pivot into paid for. It's just and actually Justin Collins, I want to say, has a talk. I'll dig it up here on lessons learned with Brakeman and trying to go from that open source to paid model. So I'll post that link, but it's just, everybody seems to agree with that it's a very difficult proposition to make. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, we've even seen that too. I mean, I know GitHub has tried to like, oh, you want to reward developers, through, the GitHub platform, be able to pay for that. But and I know you probably don't have as much insight into that anymore, Ken, but it would be interesting to talk about, how many projects actually get sponsored through GitHub, right? And what that feedback looks like. I mean, there was recently that one library, Core.js or whatever it is, that there was the big discussion around that developer who basically makes no money off of it, but it's a core project for basically anything that's out there that uses JavaScript, right? And he's had hardships and other things. There's probably more like personal things that go into it, but it really opens your eyes as far as, hey, how much can you actually make coding an open source project? Because it seems like people just, they'll do a one-time donation, but then that's it, right? Feels more like the public broadcasting model where you have to beg for funds, right? That's, I don't know.
We're once again coming to you trying to ask for monies. Yes. No, it's not great. You're right.
At least on PBS you expect it, though. I mean, it's hard. So many people have built business models around using open source software. Apache's a prime example, right? Linux. Cloud providers wouldn't exist without the ability to spin up, hundreds of thousands of free web servers with no licensing restrictions, right? Like, it's
it's interesting because I was looking at the model for SemGrep, and it's pretty interesting. They have, so the engine is open source, written in OCaml. The rules provided by the community, as well as the rules that are explicitly deemed, community rules, those are all under the LGPL 2.1 license. But the rules created solely by SemGrep, those are the ones that you pay. I mean, that's part of numerous things you can pay for with SemGrep. That one is LGPL 2.1 with common clause, so that you can't resell any of their specific rules. So theirs is an interesting model in that part of it is definitely for sure open source, but then there are like the cooler things that are definitely not open source.
You know, if they have to encrypt, do they encrypt those rules or anything? So like they're non-fungible, so you can't really tell what they are.
I'm actually not sure. I'd have to. It may even be a thing that you have to go in through SemGrep's portal to get their custom rules, but I'm not sure that's the case. I have to look.
I haven't played with those enough, or I haven't dug into them enough to tell you what they actually look like from a code perspective. I don't know. I mean, when you look at a lot of the security space, right? Like there's definitely that freemium route that people go, right? Which is what SemGrep, it feels more like a freemium product, right? Like they say it's open source, like, and it's OCaml and you can check it out, but it's such a niche tool that it is more of a, okay, here's the free version. Here's the rules that are community. And if you want the dashboard, you want all the features around it, then that's the SaaS product that's being sold. And so, but they've kind of always had that, right? Like that's been what they've gone through. They didn't go with, okay, we've only got the SemGrep, like, open source version and then waited 3 years and then tried to launch into the other space, right? Yeah. So, and maybe that's why it works a little bit better than, you know, some of the other projects, but it's hard to say.
Selling rule sets is something that I found to be really hard because they're all basically the same. So, you know, if you're talking about web app rule sets or firewall rule sets, nobody has like a huge lead in that space. They're basically all either table stakes or community property, right? Like Cisco doesn't have a giant lead in detecting brute force SSH over one of our competitors, or vice versa. So that's when you start talking about, oh, I'm going to build something and it's rules based. I'm like, yep, your product has to have some feature, some hook that is much more advanced than just the rules.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, and this is kind of like, let me share this real quick. This is good for, I think, breaking it down in terms of the pricing. So, add this to the screen. Yeah. So it's interesting. Let's just so it's actually the rules management. So you can't resell the rules. So the rules are available. It looks like all rules, they're available in the registry, and you just can't like sell those in your product. So you can't like make money off of their rules that they wrote. Community rules are fair game. The engine's fair game. But then rules management, and that makes sense, I think, when you talk more about like change control, change management type stuff, you know, where an auditor wants to see that certain things get run inside your testing space. Findings and PR comments also make sense, like an automated bot that drops comments. So it's like, to your point, there are more, and then as we go over, there's more things, right? So to your point there, Jerry, it's not really the rules they're selling, it's the more advanced features.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, and that's a lesson learned, right? I don't know. I started going through Justin Collins' presentation because it's been a while, and I was like, oh, that's right. I remember him talking about this. You know, how difficult it actually was to make that transition, and you know, how he ended up. Yeah, I don't know if he would take that same route, right? If he were to do it again.
I can tell you, I think it would be, he would not. He would
yes.
not.
yes. He would, monetize or keep it.
One of those guys who said, I can't eat clout, right? Like
from a historical perspective, like if anybody remembers, you know, about, we'll say 10 years ago, it was when the idea of Code Climate, and Brian over at Helm Camp at Code Climate was like, maybe there's a platform that I can, you know, hook into people's GitHub repos, and, you know, I can do some linting on things. And then that linting turned into like, what about the security stuff? And what existed, and what did Brian know? He knew Ruby on Rails, right? So a lot of the linting was around Ruby on Rails, and then it was security for Ruby on Rails, but that security was Brakeman under the hood. So at the time that Justin like created this product, everybody could run it on their machines, all this goodness. To pivot into the cloud was problematic because Brian had already said, you know what, I'm going to build this platform that not only does security stuff in the cloud, but it focuses a lot on your code complexity, your, you know, bunch of different statistics about your code quality, kind of stuff. So anyways, that's the brief history on that one, and why it was difficult to make a jump after having released that open source agent.
Yeah. Well, you know, for those listening, like this was not on our agenda today to talk about. So this is how things go on the podcast for us, right?
You guys have an agenda?
Well,
no, but I mean, it is. Here's what I'll say too. Like, you know, because you had mentioned this, Jerry, about, you know, I'm not sure if necessarily layoffs are the motivating factor. Maybe they're not. And for me, I can just speak to my personal story, and James is a little bit too. Like, no, you're right. Layoffs had nothing to do with it. A bunch of other reasons, can get into it another time, but layoffs had nothing to do with it. It just happened to be that at the moment of jumping off, that stuff was kind of occurring. So I imagine it's probably like this for a lot of other people. Funding is hard to get, as you guys know right now. Funding is very hard to get. However, if you can solidify it, it is like a great time to do it, I think. And also, this is my personal opinion, and I don't know if it's representative or correct, but I also think like, the three of us and our peers are reaching that age where, we've seen the good and the bad, a lot of the bad. And I think all of us like kind of have an idea of the things we'd like to see be done better. And now we're in that position to go and attack those problems, whether that's, career, finance, whatever it might be. We're in a position for one reason or another to go and, have that I don't know, that freedom to go chase those problems. So anyways, that's just my take on it. I don't know what what you think, Jerry. I think that's more important. So what do you think?
I think if you can get in as a founder, it's perfect time to do it. And I think that some of the job instabilities are running people out of the, is it FANG now, or have they changed the acronym again?
I don't know.
Facebook, Alphabet, Netflix, and I don't, whatever, back into startups. I think if you're going to a startup as an employee, you have to realize, and you should treat the equity you get at a startup as worth $0, right? I wouldn't go in as just a regular employee to a startup and count my equity as anything. But, it's a good time, and layoffs kind of get people thinking, hey, maybe my job at Microsoft or Google or anybody else who's laid off is super secure. So maybe I can go do something that I enjoy more, might enjoy more, and make a jump to a startup and start building stuff. It's a really interesting time. And I'm really, like I said at the beginning, I'm looking forward to seeing these kind of projects kind of start building out and starting to become more, more and more public. I've been doing a little bit of angel investing, recently. And I love angel investing because it's the most honest investment ever. Like you talk to the people and it's like, yeah, you can give us $10,000, but there's like a 0% chance you're ever seeing this money again, right?
Back. Yeah.
Like, you go to your regular financial advisor, they're like, oh yeah, 4 or 5%, is what we're average. So, if it's bad, you might lose a little bit. You go to do an angel investing and get like signed papers. I know the risk of this. I am likely to see none of this money ever again. And so I find myself investing in stuff that I think is just neat and has a future, right? It's almost like you said, it's giving back. It's like, okay, I have a little bit now. Here, go and try to build something cool and like keep me informed of what's going on in this startup space.
Oh yeah, 100%. And as somebody who has taken angel investment as of late, I can tell you that, it's a very honest conversation. And at the same time, like every party wants to make that money back for those people. Right. But You're right. It's a very blunt conversation. It's like, there's, who knows what the odds are of any of that ever coming back to you. Realistically, you're just kind of putting it out there and hoping it returns to you.
I don't know if a lot of people know, but if you're like interested in getting started in this, there's a website called Angel List where you can go and just like, they start the minimums at like $500 and you can just kind of like get into a bunch of different, I don't know if they're cohorts or what, but like some say, oh, I just want to do, medical startups, or I just want to do finance startups. And you can just kind of stick your toes in a little bit and start filling it out, start seeing deal flows. And it's kind of an interesting way to kind of keep your fingers on the pulse of what's going on in startup and who's doing what, especially if you want to kind of expand outside of our security bubble.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking at that Angel List website too. That's pretty interesting.
So, so to that point, right? Like, so that's what you're using, Jerry, then, or it's one of the sources to actually see what's up and coming and what people are trying to get funding for.
Yeah, I mean, I have contacts with some regular VCs, but a lot of times I just look at Angel List and I'm in some different cohorts who are focusing on different things, and you just get emails. It's like, hey, we're looking at this startup. Here's their pitch deck. Would you like to come in on the funding round? And they try to raise normally between $50,000 and $250,000, kind of combined between a group of people, and then they get in at the seed round. So
Interesting.
There's a book I
made exactly $0 back on all my investment. just to be totally clear here, my rate of return is negative 100% at this point. So
you're still looking for that unicorn that's going to return. Yeah. But I mean, I think that's the typical angel investment like strategy, though, right? Like, or even Series A, like the first round is you realize that a lot of those bets are not going to pay off, or a lot of those investments. Like, it may be a good idea, but the conditions aren't right. You know, maybe the competition is stiffer than they expected. Maybe there's some overlap and there's just not a need. It's like there's so many elements that go into the successful startup that you just can't predict, right? You're just hoping that one of them is going to take off. So eventually, hopefully it'll work out, right, Terry?
Yeah, one of my mentors said, divide by 10. If you have $10,000 you want to do an angel investing, don't give one person 10 grand. Give 10 people $1,000 a piece. And yeah, you're just playing the odds. You're playing, for lack of a better term, roulette. But you also get to get some insight into these companies, because when you do go in, you do get to see their pitch deck. You do get access to their founders or whatever. So you kind of get to see what people are building and kind of an inside look at what the future of software is going to look like.
Cool.
A lot of machine learning and YOLO. That's what the future looks like.
Yeah.
Chat GPT and YOLO nowadays, right?
I'm just waiting for Chat GPT but for to become the next thing, right? Like, it's like Twitter but for. Yeah.
That's all right. RSA, the next RSA. Let's make predictions.
Yes.
That's what everything's gonna say.
Yeah.
I did, by the way, drop a link to a book called Venture Deals. I might have mentioned this on the podcast, so apologies if I did already, or not. Maybe it's good to reiterate. But yeah, Venture Deals is a great book. If you haven't read it, it explains a lot of things besides strategy, besides the human kind of components to it, and all of that, those aspects. It also literally breaks down kind of like the terms that you'll see in a term sheet, and kind of the acronyms and the things that you need to know. I like to think it reminded me kind of like that Web App Hacker's Handbook for AppSec. That's kind of what that reminds me of for like people that are going the VC route. So anyways, highly recommend. Time to find YOLO tech. Yeah, that's well, there's plenty of it out there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So where are you going to be going besides KernelCon next, Jerry?
Yeah.
RSA and B-Side San Francisco is kind of next on kind of the list. I was just thinking about that, between about middle of December to the end of January is pretty dry on conferences. I think that feels like the downtime. We have some Cisco events spread around the Midwest I'll be getting to, but publicly I'm going to KernelCon, and then we're gearing up for a pretty big B-Sides and RSA for Cisco Secure. So I'm really excited to get out for that. And then all the summer stuff starts right after that.
How's that transition been for you, going from, Kenna to now, this kind of role that you play now at Cisco? I'm just curious to kind of catch up on everything.
Yeah, it's different. I enjoy the role I'm doing now. It's not a startup. It's the difference between working at a 70,000 people company and working at a 70 people company, right? Like, I used to DM my boss and say, hey, I'm going to go to London for a business meeting. Like, our salesperson over there wants me to come over, and I'll get a thumb up. And that was my approval, right? Like that was literally what Ed would send me for my approval. It's not that way. You have to, go through the paperwork. There's bureaucracy, people, but it's not terrible. It's just scaled different because it has to be for that many people. So, it's interesting. Days I miss the startup culture. So that's why I do a little bit of angel investing on the side, so I can still be there. And then I still have my side projects that I can dig into and code without having to go through, 4 layers and a review process. If I just want to commit to main on GitHub on my own stuff, I can, and no one can stop me.
It's funny because I was told, and there's somebody in particular who definitely watches the podcast who I talked to, and I was like, kind of talking about their reasons for leaving their job, and they were like, so basically they said, they prefer startup culture, and then I'd heard that echoed by others as well, and I didn't really understand it when I first heard it, and now I get it, and now I get why I say that is, there's pros and cons for both, right? Like I feel like there's the obvious pro for a big corp is usually better benefits, more stability, better 401k. Like for financial long-term stability, it usually feels a lot better. And then, of course, in terms of the actual work itself, a lot more compartmentalized. I feel like you can. I could work 24 hours a day, or I could work nothing, but the nothing would lead to the company's demise, right? So for me at this stage at a startup, it's like, you kind of, there's nowhere to hide, right? The work has to be done. I will say in a bigger company, you can kind of compartmentalize that work a lot more. You can kind of slide through. And then in a startup, it's interesting though, because the same flip side of that is that everything you do matters, right? It's actually important. And the benefits, the 401k, all that stuff, not necessarily there. The excitement is there every single day. Everything you do matters every single day. And you're doing hard things that are complex, and that's fun, right? So I kind of, and the culture is very different. And to your point, you can pivot on a dime and start working on something important, and you don't need anybody to tell you that's okay or whatever. It's just like, this needs to be done, and people will be happy when you go to demo it. And so it is a very different vibe, startup versus a corporation. Or we know that it's a different vibe, but in terms of why people prefer startup, I understand completely why people prefer startup, is what I'm trying to say.
And I think if you drop all the financial and the stability side, it gets down to what people thought Agile would be, right? Like in a startup, you might actually go from spinning up an EC2 instance, installing Apache, getting a certificate, fixing the security group rules, and then writing the website and deploying it, right? There's no company that's of any size whose job would be to okay, I'm going to do everything in this stack. But at a startup, you might you might be responsible for everything in that kind of full stack development that I think that people want to be involved in. And that's kind of what drives people from bigger companies back to the startup. And when they say, oh, I like the startup culture, I think a lot of it is the freedom to be able to work from a blank GitHub repo all the way to a product that you can demo without having to hand it off 15 times.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that when Microsoft acquired GitHub. It wasn't that they overnight changed their culture and people were unsatisfied with culture, but we did lose a lot of developers. And the reason was, well, of course, they had more financial freedom at that point too. But I think that wasn't really, from what I could tell, that had nothing to do with it. It had everything to do with the second you have more money and more resources and more people, to your point, the work changes and the work's not what it used to be. And you don't have the opportunities to expand your skill set and develop yourself. And those, get all that experience and do all those fun things the same way you do as soon as you have an influx of cash. So it's not even I totally see that point 100%.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's pros and cons involved with either space, right? Like to your point, Ken, like being in a startup or being in a small company, like the stress levels that are induced on a 5-person team are way different than somebody who's specialized and who's, hey, I'm responsible for this one library and it needs to be updated on a quarterly basis. And right, like, we're making it as efficient as possible, but right, like if I don't make those changes, then the business still goes on and I still get paid, right? Like that's it, right? That kind of churn and the stress that goes along with it is one of the things that you've got to take into account, right? There's people that can't handle that on a daily, weekly basis. And I find myself even having cycles within that, right? Like there's times that it just feels unbearable. And at other times it's, it's okay, right? Like it works out, but there's a lot of stuff that I have to do on a daily basis, running a business that, that's not fun, right? Like, I'll be honest, it's not very fun, but it's rewarding at the end of the day.
It varies from miserable to I'm okay.
No, there's good parts about it too, because it is like choosing your own lane, to your point, Jerry, right? Like, hey, I get to work on the stuff that I think is cool, and I can offload that other stuff, and I can bring other people in, but it's my choice at that point, right? So
an off week at a startup for one or two contributors means an off week for the business. An off week at a big company, you can observe it and move on. You might, miss a sprint or whatever, but like, yeah, if you're just not feeling it and you're one of five at a startup, you're lost 20% of your valuation, right? Or not your valuation of your, process that week.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's an interesting problem. Sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Oh, not at all. I was just going to say, but the flip side of all of this is that, Jerry, you have, when you have Cisco behind you, you have, a wider reach for, the things that really need to be said that are important inside of the industry, the things that need to be done. I feel like, so that's one really big pro is you have that backing and that reach, which you otherwise wouldn't.
Yep.
And I feel like you've been using it to good effect. Which brings us to the CVE world that you've been living in.
Yes.
Yeah, let's finally talk about CVEs. What we were going to talk about.
Yeah. Hey, we're getting there. We're talking about it. It's all good.
Roundabout getting there.
So that latest post, right? So I posted your site, Jerry. But the most recent analysis for the 2022 list, right? My first question to you is, what stands out? Right? Like, what is it that you find most interesting?
It's really, it's not the growth. It's where it's growing. And I've thought about this, and I would go back and rewrite that blog post a little bit if I had a chance. Basically, it feels like all the big people are at capacity, right? Like, you're not seeing a big growth in the Microsoft vulnerabilities, the Apple vulnerabilities, even the Google vulnerabilities year over year. Where we're seeing the growth is on these startups who are they're startups who are basically around to publish CVEs. That's their whole kind of gig. The VolDBs, the Hunter.devs, right? Like, and to some extent, even the GitHub security advisories, their stated purpose is to make it as simple as possible to get a CVE and to kind of move that out of the rarefied air back into more of an attainable process for average people and average software.
Okay. I could definitely see that. I mean, I know when that first came out, Ken and I discussed it a little bit on the podcast, and that was one of the things that that stood out to me was the number of vulnerabilities that were coming from other sources nowadays, right? And I mean, and that was part of opening it up, like we were expecting that to happen. But seeing Hunter.dev on there was interesting to me, because it is like that open source product, or not necessarily open source. I mean, but they are a common platform for reporting bugs, and they have a whole bunch of different projects that they target. They're trying to consolidate that process. Cool. So along those lines, right? Like, is there anything that is surprising in that fact to you, or anything in there in that data set?
So I'm on the automation working group for MITRE, and I like MITRE. I think what they're doing is great. So what I'm going to say isn't directed at them particularly, but I think that we're starting to see weaknesses in the CVE format because of what data is required to have a publishable CVE isn't enough for most people to find useful, right? Hunter.dev and Vol.dev, they're publishing CVEs that meet all the requirements, but they don't have enough data. Sometimes Hunter.dev will post a CVE that just says, there's a vulnerability in this GitHub commit, and have the GitHub commit hash in the description. That's fine, but I have no idea what that is. And when you think about it, that description is normally about 40 or 50% of all the data in a CVE. It's it's super hard to find a lot of value in that. And then a lot of people don't understand that MITRE publishes the CVE, but then it moves over to NIST and the NVD to add the data that a lot of us look at, like the CVSS score and the CVEs. And it's hard for them to properly score and to properly add CPE data to some of these other vulnerabilities from these 100.devs and these community type CNAs, because it's not in their lane, right? They've got really good at adding CPEs for Microsoft, Google, and stuff because it's all built out. But the data is, they're trying their best, but it's hard because the data is expanding.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this probably goes back to my, like, I mean, I have a hard time, like, when I'm as a pen tester, as a consultant, as somebody that's looking at code, and I find a CVE that's associated with a specific, and whether that source is Microsoft or whether it is hunter.dev or whatever it, or what may be, actually taking that information and representing it to management or a technical, or a client as, this is the impact of this CVE. And I know this is a lot of stuff that Kenna was doing, right? Trying to map that out. But I just feel like that process, from what I'm getting here, is it's getting harder and harder to actually do that impact and risk analysis when, okay, like, great, there's a commit hash. I've got to go review this whole commit to figure out actually what's happening and where the vulnerability is. And then at that point, is that something that's being used in my product or in my in my application? That it's a whole, like, analysis stream that I just don't have the time for. Like, clients not paying me to do that.
And another thing that ends up, especially in open source projects that aren't their own CNA, is that they don't get a voice in whether a CVE is published a lot or not. I know this was kind of a knock on GitHub a little bit. Like, if Ken found something that I wrote on GitHub, he could file a CVE request and get a CVE for it. And I may never know, right? Like, unless somebody opens a PR or an issue in my account, I would never know. And then if it's wrong, or if you think it's wrong, you're on the back foot there, and you're having to then fight against that CVE being open. If you're like, no, that's not how that works, or that's not a real vulnerability, you already have the CVE published, and then you have to go through the whole trying to get it rejected stage, which isn't fun. So that's a lot harder than being Microsoft and getting to control and the CVE publishing coming at the end. A lot of these open source projects, the CVE publishing is coming at the very beginning, and then you're running backwards to try to get it fixed for free because you're not getting paid to write this open source code.
So basically, you're guilty until proven innocent.
Yep.
Yep.
In that case, that's interesting. Do they? Well, I guess no. Because if it's public, oh man, yeah, that's it's not a good look. I can see why that would be problematic for sure.
So we're doing. We're not ready to release the research yet, but we're looking at it. Right, the number of CVEs that have fixes, and the number is coming down quite dramatically. Because normally you have, here's a CVE, we can find out where the patch is. On a lot of these open sources, we're like, here's a CVE, no patch, right? Like there's no patch. So that number in 2022 and 2023 skyrocketed.
Yeah, that makes sense why it would. Sorry, I got distracted by somebody delivering something to the house.
No worries.
That's why
So along those lines, right? Like, so if the patches like that, yeah, if there's no patch for the CVE, right? Are we starting to see like a degradation then of the value of a CVE database, right? Like, I mean, like that's always the question that I get is, right, especially when you're doing dependency check or any of the dependency analysis for CVEs, is most of the time it ends up being we're going to put that on the backlog because again, like, from a risk perspective, we don't know what that actually equates to, and nobody's actually exploiting that because whatever, right? Like, it's prototype pollution or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, a lot of it's that, and a lot of it is legwork that people don't know because they're not kind of experts in the process. So, say Hunter.dev filed a CVE for an open source project that I have, right? And then they opened up an issue, and I fixed it. That doesn't automatically, NVD is not looking at that. And it's not MITRE's job to fix that. If I want that patch to be reflected on that CVE record, I then have to go and email MITRE and have them add it as a reference. And so, like, you have to have a whole, like, if you're an open source maintainer, you have to almost be deeply dug into the CNA CVE publishing process that's really been kind of closed source, and only big companies had CNA and they kind of understood how it works, to now where you really have to kind of understand to get that patch listed on that CVE page.
Yeah, that's kind of, because you're bringing up a point that was in my head. I'm like, well, should there be some guideline? Because if you're going to be a CNA, right, shouldn't there be some guidelines that you have to follow to include validation of the issue to issue a CV? Or clearly that's not the case. It sounds like you just pretty much just issue it as someone said that it's vulnerable. So it's kind of honestly what it sounds like is happening.
You're supposed to validate it, but validation is in the eye of the beholder, right? Like, and I don't know anybody works at any of these companies, but I think a lot of it is, think of a level 1 SOC analyst going through alerts, probably the same skill set going through 1,000 CVE requests, right? Like, you go and look, oh, that code looks like it could launch a cross-site scripting, right? I'm going to approve it. So, you just kind of move it on, versus somebody who has a really deep understanding of the code base and can make that super important decision if it's actually vulnerable or not, or if it rises to the level of needing a CVE. But that's also questionable because the CVE database isn't that outsized yet. It's only 200,000 records. So, it's still manageable by most people. It definitely hasn't got into that big data category yet.
Yeah. So basically, the amount of information coming in exceeds the capacity of those to validate it. And so then it becomes a community validation after the fact, after it's released almost, it sounds like.
Yep, basically.
Well, yeah, that's going to be prone to some problems.
A lot of times it's not even validated. We see this quite a bit. Google is known for it, right? Like, they'll say, this vulnerability has been reported exploited in the wild, and then you never hear or never see anyone else reporting that it's exploited, and they don't give enough information in the patch to even, or in the CVE to even let you understand what was going on, right?
Right. That is so annoying. That gets to me whenever I see that. Because it's like, how can you? Yeah. How do you know what is? Yeah. I want to know that. I want to get granular as to the details. I don't want vagary. It doesn't help. Doesn't make it actionable. Doesn't make it easy for us to validate.
Yeah. Well, and
so
I always
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I always go back to what it is that I have to report. Like, if I report a vulnerability and it doesn't contain reproduction steps, it doesn't contain actual code as to this is how it was found, this is the area that I actually saw it. I don't know how I'd feel. It almost feels like just a publicity grab at some point, right? Right. And I know we see this in the bug bounty world as well, right? Just reports because, I ran a scanner or whatever it is. I found something that may or may not be, but I'm trying to get money or I'm trying to get publicity out of it. And that's where I start to have a problem with it if it doesn't contain that sort of detail. Yeah. But I know we're not going to solve it here, right? It's just it's interesting to see how it's changed over the years, especially with the new CNAs, especially with the new processes. We're starting to target more of those open source apps. Feels like there needs to be a little bit more of I don't know, definition in the policy or explanation of the process to open source developers, how they can actually get involved with it, because otherwise the data is going to get worse and worse is kind of my take on it.
Well, and that becomes the question, right? Do you want maximum data that's going to be a little bit worse, or do you want a really heavily regulated CVE database that has some extra stuff and has more data, right? The Kenna model leans towards having as much data, and then we do all that heavy work on the back end and tell you what to fix. So, I'm not disappointed in that model. I think that works, but you could, there's discussion to say we're going to add more data points. We're going to make it harder to get a CVE, but every time we get a CVE, it's going to be top notch and stuff that you actually need to pay attention to. Because a little bit of both ways. I mean, I go back and forth, and I don't know, depending on the day, depends on which way I feel. But, I never mind having more data, but at the same time, I would like to have the best data possible. So,
yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I guess in general, in that model where more data is better than presumably having more CNAs, like, and there's a bar, there should be a bar for being a CNA, is a good value add in that model. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on, this really comes down to government officials. And I get to talk about this. I think it's what I'm talking about at KernelCon, right? Like,
sweet.
NVD is really the linchpin in this for most people, and they're funded by the U.S. government, and they are what makes CVE go from useless to useful, right? Like, if they don't do the CWE correctly, if they don't really like lean in and get the CPE data correctly or score the CVSS right, that's when it breaks down, right? Because we really look at them to get that data. I think when people look at CVEs, they understand that MITRE publishes them, but MITRE just kind of publishes the framework, and nobody really uses the NVD or uses the CVE until NVD has gotten their analysis done on that. And it's taken them a little bit longer. I think they're about at over 8 days for analysis on a CVE today, but they're trying and they're doing their best. I'm probably as plugged in as anybody, and I can't tell you how many humans are doing that work, but it has to be thankless work, and they're just at it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, and the interesting thing about CVEs is like how the weird way, I mean, not weird, but the ways that I mean, I'm sure you can talk to some of this, but initially, like the only places I really see CVEs are like, a scanner, if it had like results, would say like, oh, here's the CVE associated with it. And then I guess the other side would be like when vendors said, hey, you need to upgrade because we have some sort of CVE. But now there's all this tooling out there, especially around the supply chain security stuff and SBOM and all of this. And there's just, I mean, there's a plethora. I mean, even bug bounty platforms tend to tie, at least use some level of CVE and CVSS, references. I mean, it's everywhere now. And so I don't know, like, are there anything, I guess the one question would be like, are there any ways or areas that have surprised you that you've learned about that these things get used in your travels?
I talked to a ton of people. CVEs is a security industry's Rosetta Stone, right? No matter which way you're talking, it becomes the common denominator and the way that we're able to decode it. So you have to say, here's the CVE, and then I can take the CVE, I can put it into a SAST or a DAST, or I can take it and talk about a patch that I need to run. It's just, the issue is you just bounce back and forth, and there's nothing better than a CVE to say, okay, here's what we're talking about, and then from there, you can pivot it either way on your research. But it's the only thing we have as kind of a common denominator across the industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So, I mean, we've got CVEs. Yeah, the other thing that popped up in the Slack channel this last week was the CWE analysis that kind of, I mean, it does start to play into that, right? The weaknesses that are associated with CVEs, how many are actually seen. Let me post that link really quick because I wondered what your take on this was. I know we were, and CWEs, those listening, that's common
and I
weakness
said
in our
I've
industry.
loved NVD 3 or 4 times on there, right? And I want to say it again. I love the work NVD does. I think that their CWE analysis is their CWE assignment is a little bit off and a little bit bad because so many of them fall into these giant just catch-all CWEs. And I think 79 was the top one. I haven't had a chance to look at that link, but when I ran it, like cross-site scripting had like 4 times as many CWE assignments as anything else. So, I mean, they're just trying to bucket it, but CWE is so wide and has so many buckets. I think it's hard for them to figure out which bucket it falls in.
Yeah. Well, and so if you look at that, you don't have to look at the link right now, actually. So 79 cross-site scripting is 2 in that. The first one is actually out of bounds right, 787, which, buffer overflows. It's basically what it equates to. And I don't know about the two of you, but like the number of times that I run into a buffer overflow on a daily basis is pretty much nil at this point, right? That's just the space that I play in. And so like I have a hard time equating what's going on there in CWE and even in CVE land with what I see as a consultant and in the security space on a daily basis. And maybe it's because I'm not on the research side of things. I'm more in the tactical, the analysis of new and upcoming projects, that's the reason. But like, I'm wondering what your take on that is, that buffer overflows are still such a high mark, I guess, right?
Well, can I add to that real quick before Jerry responds? One thing I learned today when I was reading Jerry's article was that, and I didn't know this before until before today, was that CVEs get generated not based off of the year that they were found, but based off of the year, I guess they were introduced or something along those lines. But so you could have something that came out, or no, do I have that wrong? Correct me here, Jerry.
The year the vulnerability was discovered is supposed to indicate the CVE ID, and not the year it was published.
Right. Sorry,
People get that kind of tricked up because we have CVEs like this year. There's still more CVE 2022s that have been published than CVEs 2023s. That'll flip around pretty soon. But like last year, we had the oldest CVE by identifier was 3 CVEs from VolDB from Black Ice, right? Like, and I reached out to Rob Graham, and he didn't even know that they had been published. He's like, why is somebody releasing CVEs for software from 2011, right?
Right. But I think why I'm kind of raising that too is like, I guess now that I know that it's a little inverse of what I was originally thinking, maybe this doesn't come into play, but I was thinking like, wait, maybe, maybe it was, okay. So I'm just making sure I have this correct. So, if the vulnerability was made public now in 2022 for buffer overflows, or 2021 or whatever, fairly recently, that could be just a matter of our ability to detect buffer overflows in older software. I don't know. I'm kind of answering for you, Jerry. So I'm sorry. When you Seth asked that question, it started to play in my mind. Like, I wonder if that discrepancy factors into why we would see more buffer overflows now, whereas you would think there would be less, given more memory managed safe language. Is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, but I'm going to be quiet. You give your hypothesis, Jerry.
No, you're right. You're 100% right. It's they find stuff and it goes back. It gets back ported into software that's not used or hasn't been used often. And I think another thing that the top 25 that link that Seth misses out is that about 1/3 of CVEs, NVD just gives up on and says, I can't bucket this, right? And it's tagged NVD no CWE info, right? That's what they mark it as when they don't know where to put it.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's at 1/3, right? That's a huge number when it comes down to it. But I understand the difficulty, right? Like we find things in software all the time that we're like, oh, where do we classify this under, right? Is it one of those big buckets? Is it, some business logic fly? I mean, usually there's a place that you can shoehorn your way into.
Yeah.
But I realize that they're trying to be more precise than that, right? There has standards around this is what it has to be to go into this bucket, which makes me wonder how much those CWEs, like it would be interesting to analyze that 1/3 to see, if there is differences of opinion or what the main driver there actually is. Because it's very easy to classify a buffer overflow or cross-site scripting. I get that. Yeah. Interesting. 1/3 of it. Yeah. Cool.
WordPress scan is a CNA. That's
interesting. They killed it. They were one of the first what I would call non-software CNA, and for 2 or 3 years they led the publishing because they were finding CVEs all the time and in WordPress plugins that 10 people might run, but they would file a CVE for you.
Yeah, I was kind of laughing for that reason because I assume that's the reason. Is that there's just so many vulnerabilities in the WordPress plugin space. I was like, oh man, they had to become a CNA because when you look at it, it's kind of hilarious that they're juxtaposed against, like Microsoft and Trend Micro and all these big behemoth that have, all kinds of different software stacks they're invested in. And anyways, this just kind of made me laugh. It's like, man, that many vulnerabilities, and you had to become a CNA. But anyways, sorry, WordPress friends. No, don't be a jerk.
Yeah, you've got Apple that has less than 100, and then WordPress like this year, right? Looking at that CVE ICU, and then WP Scan is almost to 400, right? Like just like 3 or 4 times the number. What does that tell you about PHP? Wait, no, we won't get into that. Right? Yeah,
we won't get into that. Yeah,
we won't get into that.
Yeah, you say that, but man, Laravel's got some good usage for PHP frameworks. I was looking into it recently. It's actually got some pretty decent uptake.
Yeah, it does, right? And I mean, it's it's a decent MVC, right? If if PHP is the language that you use. All right, okay, we've been going for an hour. I did have one question that's just in a completely different space for both of you before we call it. I want to make sure that we're cognizant of Jerry's time since he's giving it to us, right? So a question popped up recently. One of the, somebody in Slack DM'd me and asked for favorite tokens that we search for in developer comments. And they were trying to build out a word list. So I thought that it would be a fun thing to just ask both of you, like, what is your favorite either find or like interesting comment token that you would search for in a code base?
Did you send me, Seth, a article about cursing and code quality?
I did. This is part of why it came up, right?
Okay. Because I was going to say cursing, but then after you said that, I'm like, I don't know, because I look for that in commit messages, just because usually by the time someone's figured out whatever they figured out, they're frustrated and they just made it work. It doesn't mean it's the best. Often it means it's not. But so then to hear that the opposite, but I think they were talking about comments in code, not commit messages, which there's a difference, right? So, but anyways,
So basically the research that they put in was basically the code quality of code when they found curse words in the comments associated with it was better statistically from you can go read the article, but it was better, statistically from form and function and how it was, with whatever they put into it than code that did not have curse words in it. So I mean, I know that's a fun one to search for. What?
the fact that that person put comments in at all means there's probably that just having comments is probably a good indicator of code complex or I keep saying complex code quality. Sorry.
Yep.
Exactly. I don't look for the API keys as much as I look for the URLs. Like I found like if I'm looking like searching for the API URL will often find keys because it can be named so many different things. So like if I know if I want to get to an API, I'm doing an assessment, I go hit GitHub and paste their URL string and then just start digging through that code is one of the ways that I've seen. And a lot of times that gives you a lot of insight into how people are using and sometimes abusing an API.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good call out, right? Like the URLs, like whether or not it shows up in the comments, if it is like part of a variable or whatever else, like it starts to give you indicators pretty quickly about hard coded values and, what's actually being analyzed and, what people are actually using it for. So cool. Good. All right. Well, there you go, Jesse. Like we got curse words and we got URLs. I feel like every assessment I get into, I build to that list.
Work in progress, security, authorization, auth-z, authentication. Just a lot of that kind of stuff. Usually people will talk about, you can even look for things like directly or lookup or things like that. And usually you'll find some interesting IDOR style stuff. There's all kinds of, honestly, Seth, this is something we should publish is the word list that we use during our code reviews.
Yeah. I mean, that was where the question came from is somebody was doing a code review and they're like, we want to make sure we're searching for everything. And I was like, okay, here's a list that I start with, but it's so dynamic, right? Jerry, what were you going to say?
Oh, it wasn't a code review, but somebody sent me a link to a GitHub search that just searched for the name of their keybot or whatever. I don't remember the name of the service or whatever. And they said that that's a good way to find keys because people will say, GitHub keybot found this, so we're removing it, and then they don't go back and clean the commit history, so it's still there.
Yeah, commit histories are always fun. You'll find all kinds of like juicy goodness inside of that. Yeah.
And honestly, along that line, right? Like, I think I find like the comments for code are interesting, but it's usually indicators of what the developer's trying to do there. But the commit history is way more fruitful from a security perspective, right? Like when you're looking for authorization changes or, hacks or, they're pissed off and they just wanted to make something work at 2 a.m., right? Like timings and all that kind of stuff. It's amazing, right?
That would be something that'd be a class that even I would be interested in taking. Like Git is so complicated. Like I would be super interested in taking either a workshop or something like how to manage Git, like, secure Git. Like when should you rebase, right? Like when should you delete it? Like how do you handle that in a long-term manner? Because, it's always, and I don't know why, but it seems like the security guy always gets the issue of, this junior dev committed the code, so now you have to go and figure out and fight through a way to delete all of the code, either figure out a way to pull this one commit or just delete every commit.
Yeah. Rewinding GitHub is so like you're right. Like rebase is the way, but the second that it's public. And
Which I can tell you when
all bets are off.
When I joined GitHub, back, that was in 2017, much smaller company. I'm sure they don't do this anymore, or maybe they do, but I doubt it. So they did that. That was part of the thing is like, because everybody, including, it doesn't matter what your job was at GitHub, you're going to use GitHub, right? So they did that workshop on not only like, how to use the platform for like discussions and issues, or not this, they didn't have discussions, issues, comment threads and all that stuff. And just how repos work and all that, but also like, some of the basics of how to use Git in that way. Just because, like I said, you've got people that are going to be like finance will host their things on GitHub. Like when you're, again, going back to the beginning of this, startup versus big company, right? At that time it was more of a startup vibe. So everybody operated on one place because that was the product. That was the company. Anyways, it was really,
I could just see a finance professional like, oh no, I committed, raises.xls to I have to rewind this right now.
Yeah.
Everyone's
Oh, yeah.
salaries and bonuses all get pushed out in an issue. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
That'd be horrifying.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. Yes. Sounds like some Git
them.
spelunking is in our future. So. Well, cool. We'll go ahead and wrap it for today. Like I said, this episode was sponsored by Redpoint Security. And
Our 200th episode.
200th episode. If you're interested in sponsoring, reach out to us, info or sponsor at Redpoint or at absoluteappsec.com. And yeah, otherwise, Jerry, thanks so much for your time today. Sounds like you're going to be at B-Sides, at KernelCon. Any place else that anything else you want to say before we call it today?
No, I'm super glad to be here, and I hope to run into people soon. And yeah, and if you're having a startup, ping me somewhere. I'd love to sit down and talk to you about what you're doing and get involved. So I think that's kind of where I'm leaning next, is doing a little bit more startup stuff.
Awesome. Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening and interacting. As always, join Slack. Let us know, what you come up with, and we'll see everybody next week.
And at KernelCon, all three.
And at KernelCon. Yes. Yeah.
All
right. Thanks, everyone.